1 year ago, the greatest of all wars came to an end. The people of the world relieved their tired nerves in a wild burst of celebration. In the far Pacific, where the mighty ships of the U.S. Navy commanded the approaches to Japan, the big guns were silent, the men tense, expectant. Scarcely 4 months after the defeat of Germany, the last of the Axis, tenacious, fanatical Japan, had surrendered on the eve of invasion. The Japs had not quit for lack of men or arms. Great armies waited to defend their home islands. Artillery, suicide planes, new amphibian tanks were ready for the final battle. But as the Jap prepared for invasion, a lone B-29 dropped a single atomic bomb on the munition city of Hiroshima. Smoke rose 50,000 feet as an explosion equal to 20,000 tons of TNT brought the greatest man-made disaster in the history of the world. The Japs were stunned, but still they hesitated. So 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki, wiping out 1/3 of that industrial center. That was the final blow. Even the fanatical Japanese could see the danger of total annihilation. So they surrendered, unwillingly, but unconditionally. The prologue to the great drama of surrender was begun. The Americans moved swiftly toward occupation. First soldiers to set foot on Japanese soil came, appropriately enough, from the air, as troops of the 11th Airborne Division landed at Atsugi. Then Marines and Blue Jackets moved in at the Yokosuka Naval Base. They went ashore armed to the teeth, but there was no bleeding or dying on the beaches that day. They walked in unchallenged, unopposed, as conquerors. Surrender of the base was swift, precise. Included was the once mighty battleship Nagato, later used as a target ship for the atomic bomb test in Operation Crossroads. Transports from Okinawa swarmed onto Atsugi Airfield to prepare for the arrival of the Supreme Allied Commander. Wrecked Jap planes littered the battered field. But Japanese labor cleared away the debris. Atsugi was American manned and ready when the C-54 arrived, bearing the man who was to direct the future destiny of Japan. Bataan was remembered, and avenged. MacArthur moved to his next great role aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Here on the morning of September 2nd, the drama of surrender reached its climax. In a ceremony that lasted only 20 minutes, the fate of Japan was sealed forever. The 11-man Japanese delegation was photographed by cameramen, perched at every vantage point to record the momentous event for posterity. The stage was set. General MacArthur walked from a cabin to open the surrender ceremonies.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
On behalf of Emperor Hirohito, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed for the Japanese government. Japan accepted unconditional surrender according to the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration.
The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers will now sign on behalf of all the nations at war with Japan. Will General Wainwright and General Percival step forward and accompany me while I sign?
General Jonathan Wainwright, liberated hero of Corregidor, and British General Arthur Percival, who was forced to surrender Singapore, stood at attention behind MacArthur as he began to write his name with the first of 5 pens. Pen number 1 went to General Wainwright. The second pen was handed to General Percival. The third and fourth were earmarked for the National Archives and West Point. The fifth, Mac kept for himself.
These proceedings are closed.
The main drama of surrender was over. Now, throughout the Japanese Empire, in 5 designated surrender regions, the field armies of Japan laid down their guns. All enemy forces in China yielded to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Those in Manchuria and northern Korea to the Soviets. In the Burma theater, East Indies and Southwest Pacific, they gave up to Admiral Mountbatten and the Australian commander. Admiral Nimitz took the surrender in the Central Pacific. And General MacArthur in Japan, Southern Korea, and the Philippines. High in Luzon in misty Baguio, a great moment came for Generals Wainwright and Percival. They, who had been forced to raise the white flag in 1942, now saw an arch foe capitulate. General Yamashita, the notorious Tiger of Malaya, who was later executed for his war crimes. Wake Island. All America was moved by reverent pride at the news that Old Glory flew once more over that tiny atoll in the Central Pacific. Here, where the Marine Corps had again immortalized itself by its heroic defense, wreckage still remained of the handful of Grumman Wildcats that had helped fight off an entire Jap task force for 14 days. Throughout the Pacific area and Asia, liberated peoples celebrated in wild rejoicing. For these were the hours of reckoning and of rescue. Rescue, not alone for oppressed peoples, but also for Allied prisoners of war who had endured hardships and atrocities in hundreds of PW camps. Survivors of Bataan and Wake, Singapore and Hong Kong. Men from ships sunk at sea or planes shot down in combat, awakened at last from a nightmare of hunger and brutality. The world, already shocked at the horrors of German concentration camps, shuddered as Japanese barbed wire gave up its living dead. The savagery, filth, and starvation were reminiscent of the death camps at Buchenwald and Belsen. Victims brought forth the living evidence of beating with bats, rifle butts, and bamboo rods. Red Cross packages were nearly all stolen by the guards. Death claimed many of the 200,000 Allied prisoners. But for those who lived to see the day of liberation, there was freedom at last. And cheering news for thousands of homes the world over. Owing to the Jap trick of not reporting numerous Allied prisoners, men long believed dead could now flash the happy word of their survival. rescued were moved from the Japanese shore to waiting hospital ships. For them, even more than for their comrades in arms, the victory was complete. Yes, victory was complete. Now Japan, a prisoner of the United Nations, was to learn the meaning of submission. Her armies were disarmed and disbanded. Her weapons destroyed. Her war leaders on trial for their lives. The flag that ruled Japan was no longer the rising sun. And the supreme authority had passed from a Jap known as Hirohito to an American named MacArthur. A new day had dawned for Japan, a grim day of disillusionment and hardship, of hard work and atonement for its crimes against the world. Yet, even for guilty Japan, there was hope. For VJ Day was, in a way, a day of victory for the people of Japan, too. It meant liberation from the military overlords, the feudal system, and warlike ideals that had led them to give fanatical devotion to a hopeless, costly war. Even as a conquered enemy, the Jap is enjoying greater freedom under his new bosses than he had ever known under his native rulers. Greater freedom to read and write different political opinions, to argue and criticize on public street corners, on the air, by petition, and by the ballot. It is neither softness nor laxity on our part. It is instead a carefully guided and supervised revolution in the Japanese way of life. Even as we cleared the rubble from his devastated cities, we are purging his mind of narrow, fanatical, war-breeding ideas. He is being given his first taste of freedom of the mind, the freedom that is the breath of democracy, the freedom that will give his children a chance at a better way of life than poverty or war. For only by learning the blessings of the democratic way will he acquire a permanent will to peace, end the threat of another war for conquest, end our long, costly job of occupation. The signs after a year are encouraging. The Japanese people, stricken for centuries by a drought of freedom, have responded thirstily to the opportunities offered them by their conquerors. The impassive little yellow man, known to the West as the inscrutable Oriental, has received these changes eagerly. Hirohito himself is a symbol of these changes in Japanese life. The man who had accepted the reverence of his people as divine now walks humbly among them, fraternizing, eager to prove that he is not a god, but very much a man. Even more significant and encouraging to Western eyes is the new dignity and freedom for Japanese women. Not only do they now vote, but they have elected one of their own sex, modest Takuchi Shigeo, who, like a good housewife, was tilling her vegetable garden when the good news came. The Japanese have shown great adaptability to the material side of Western civilization, in factories and machines, in the architecture of his public buildings and homes, in clothing. Now there is strong hope that they may learn and believe in the Western ideals of peace and freedom, that they may respond to the words of the man most instrumental to that day of victory, who said,
"It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice."